Hey, my YouTube friends, this is the Range Ronin, and I present today what started out as an inner dialogue, a discussion that I had with myself regarding the Uberti reproduction of the 1875 Remington Single Action Army, also known as the Improved Army, or Frontier Army, depending on the barrel length. Basically, I was planning how to present this review of this fine revolver. I decided, why not take my inner dialogue and turn it into an outer dialogue, an exchange of questions and answers, or, if you will, an interview with myself. I have substituted the voice of myself as the interviewer, but use my voice as the interviewee. Stick around for this interview, because you will learn plenty about the 1875 Remington Single Action Army and the Uberti reproduction of.
Hello everyone, I am here today with the Range Ronin who decided to do this review of the Uberti reproduction of the 1875 Remington Single Action Army in a rather unique way, by having an out loud interview with his alter ego, me. I'll be asking questions about the Uberti reproduction of the 1875 Remington Single Action Army to help Ronin, and you, through the review. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here for this rather unique presentation as I tap into the Range Ronin's knowledge regarding this revolver. So, let me begin with the first question. Can you tell our viewers a bit of history behind the original 1875 Remington Single Action Army?
Sure, I have a small bit of knowledge in that area that I think is worth sharing. But first, thank you for being here as a guide for this review, as hopefully I will cover everything that needs to be addressed with the Uberti reproduction of the 1875 Remington Single Action Army. It's not often that I get to have a discussion with my alter ego out loud and have folks listen in on that discussion. So, let's get to your first question. First, there was the 1858 Remington, or more accurately called the Remington Beals model revolver, beginning life as a 6-shot revolver in 3 calibers, 31, the pocket model, 36, the Navy, or 44, the Army caliber. Remington Beals model revolvers were used during the American Civil War, especially after the Colt factory fire in 1864. In 1868, Remington began offering 5-shot metallic cartridge conversions of the revolver in .46 rimfire. Remington paid a royalty fee to Smith & Wesson, owners of the Rowland White patent, number 12,648, April 3, 1855, on bored-through revolver cylinders for metallic cartridge use. The 1858 Remington Army cartridge conversions were the first large-caliber cartridge revolvers available, beating even Smith & Wesson's .44 American to the market by nearly 2 years. When Rowland White's request of extension for his breech-loading revolver patent was rejected by the American government in January 1870, Colt Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company started working on its own metallic cartridge rear loaders. Up until then, it had only been practicing the so-called Richards-Mason conversions. Colt continued converting muzzle-loading percussion revolvers into rear loaders until 1878. But in 1871, Colts had patented at least 2 rear-loading revolvers using metallic cartridges, the Colt House revolver and the open top. The House revolver went into production the same year in 1871, but the open top didn't start production until 1872. It was a failure of the 1871-1872 Colt open-top revolver in qualifying for the U.S. Army's demand for a robust revolver that led Colt to design a completely new revolver that became the standard from which other single-action revolvers are measured, the 1873 Colt Single-Action Army. The 1858 Remington Army conversions, however, were considered by some superior revolvers to the Colt, and many were carried by civilians, law enforcement, and soldiers. However, the 1873 Colt Single-Action Army was the Army's choice of revolvers, and Remington took a back seat. The 1875 Remington New Army, however, was still considered by many as the better revolver. In a sense, the Remington revolver was the Chevrolet to the Colt's Ford. Between 25,000 and 30,000 Remington revolvers were manufactured during the years of 1875 to 1889 in three different ammunition sizes: 44 Remington centerfire, 44-40, and 45 Long Colt. These were not optional. Rather, the caliber of production models was determined by their date of manufacture. These revolvers were manufactured to be in direct competition with the new Colt Single-Action Army that was introduced in 1873.
Thanks for the brief history lesson. Obviously, there were differences between the 1858 and 1875 Remington revolvers. Could you expound on that?
Certainly. The 1875 Remington New Army differed from the 1858 Remington conversion in a few areas. It had a 7.5-inch round barrel as compared to the 1858 8-inch octagon barrel. It had an updated front sight, a fluted cylinder, and walnut grip panels. The finish was blued or nickel-plated with a case-hardened hammer and loading gate. The color case-hardened frame on the Uberti Reproduction is not period correct, but it looks nice and has a nice pattern. A spring-loaded cartridge ejector rod replaced the no-spring ejection rod of the 1858 model. It had a completely redesigned frame. Note that the cylinder pin lock on the Uberti Reproduction is not correct, but was added by Uberti and is similar to the Colt. The 1875 Remington New Army was designed as a true cartridge revolver rather than a conversion like the 1858 model. The loading gate was redesigned and resembles that of the Colt 1873 Single-Action Army. The firing pin is hammer-mounted and protrudes through the frame. The 1858 Remington's firing pin was internal to the frame. Finally, it had a lanyard ring. Standard barrel length was 7.5 inches, as with my model. That, in the real world, would have been considered as the improved Army revolver, although a very few revolvers were produced with 5 3/4-inch barrels. Uberti calls this the Frontier model. The familiar sail was retained, however, and was perhaps a means to distinguish the Remington revolvers from the Colt line. The 1875 Remington New Army was the last revolver manufactured by Remington that incorporated the sail in its design.
You said that the Remington was the Chevy to the Ford when comparing the Remington to the Colt Single-Action Army. What did you mean by that?
The 1875 Remington New Army was a robust revolver and tipped the scales at about 2.8 pounds unloaded, as compared to the 1873 Colt Single-Action Army that weighed about 2.3 pounds unloaded. Overall, the Remington was just a more robust revolver than the Colt. Today's time, I would say that the Remington revolver was the Ruger of its time. It also was more expensive than the Colt.
Interesting. So let's turn the attention to the Uberti reproduction of the 1875 Remington. What can you begin to tell us?
The Uberti 1875 Remington Outlaw is a very close reproduction of the original revolver, but not an exact replica. With this version, the lanyard ring does not exist. The lanyard ring was removed by many users at the time, honest folks as well as outlaws, and was not needed. However, some lanyard rings remained because many could not afford a good holster, and these revolvers were stuffed into trousers and sashes, a makeshift lanyard could be used to keep from losing the revolver.
When one compares the 1873 Colt single-action Army to the Remington, what really stands out?
If one compares the 1875 Remington New Army with the Colt 1873 single-action Army, one thing is apparent: the difference in grip. The 1873 Colt single-action Army's backstrap is more swept back, which allows the revolver to roll or plow in the hand. The backstrap of the Remington 1875 New Army is more downward and slightly inward. Although the grip is flared at the bottom, it is, in my mind, more comparable to the Smith & Wesson No. 3 and Colt Bisley revolvers, though not so pronounced. When shooting the Remington, it seems that the hand plays more of a part in recoil control than the Colt. The grip of the 1875 Remington New Army fits my hand better than the 1873 Colt single-action Army. The front of the grip is also set back more than Colt revolvers, a feature that works well in my hands when on rare occasions I shoot a single-action revolver two-handed.
What about the safety features of the Uberti?
Well, it must be noted that the Uberti version of the 1875 Remington Improved Army does not incorporate a hammer block safety, just like the original. As with the original, however, there are 3 hammer positions: quarter cock, half cock, and full cock. Quarter cock position could be considered as a safety, I suppose, as this prevents the firing pin from resting against the primer of a live cartridge. However, I am not a fan of leaving the hammer in this position. The cowboy loading of load 1, skip 1 would be a good practice to exercise if one carried the Uberti, as the hammer is down on a live round otherwise. At the range with the Uberti, or any Uberti reproduction of the Remington, Colt, and Smith & Wesson revolvers for that matter, I like to keep the hammer down on an empty chamber when I'm not actually shooting, just for my own peace of mind.
What about the cylinder base pin on the Uberti reproduction? Is that different from what was on the original 1875?
You might take note of the cylinder base pin on the 1875 Remington New Army revolver. Unlike the short cylinder base pin of the 1873 Colt single-action Army, the cylinder base pin of the 1875 Remington New Army inserts into the long sail of the revolver. On the original 1875 Remington New Army, the cylinder base pin was held into place by a spring latch system at the front of the cylinder base pin. The Uberti model differs from the original in that a spring-loaded detent pin is used, just like that found on the Colt 1873 single-action Army.
What about the fit and finish of the Uberti reproduction?
The fit and finish on the Uberti 1875 is very good, but just short of excellent. While the bluing on the barrel assembly is excellent, cylinder bluing is not uniform. This, however, is not a game stopper, and in no way takes away from the performance of the revolver. The grip panels at the backstrap are slightly rough and not exactly matched to the backstrap. Some very light sanding and buffing are needed to smooth out the fit. Again, this is not a game stopper.
What about the color case hardened frame of the Uberti reproduction? Is that true to the original?
The nice pattern on the color case hardened frame is a good contrast with the bluing of the rest of the revolver. The color case hardened frame of the Uberti reproduction is not period correct. The hammer is nicely patterned and lends a nice contrast with the blue steel barrel assembly, trigger guard assembly, and the nicely grained two-piece grip panels. The grip panels are the only items that I would like to change on this revolver. As is common to Uberti firearms, the grip panels just seem too red to me. While I don't think that a nice set of aged stag grips would look good on this revolver, a nice set of dark walnut grip handles might. By the way, although Uberti also makes an 1875 Remington New Army revolver with a brass trigger guard, it is not period correct. The original revolver was all steel.
Would you tell us about the sights?
The front sight is a high unit that is much better than the original, with the rear sight being a standard groove on top of the backstrap. The front sight was spot on for a 6 o'clock hold, with the POI about 1.5 inches high from POA at 15 yards. After shooting revolvers and pistols with a short sight radius, the 7.5-inch barrel on this beast is welcomed by my old eyes, and I can see why folks of the past who carried these revolvers liked their accuracy.
I would assume that the trigger pull weight, being a single action-only revolver, would be light. Would you care to expound?
The trigger pull weight on this particular revolver is just over 2.5 pounds. It has a crisp let-off with virtually no overtravel. The cylinder locks up tight, and the flash gap measures less than 4/1000 of an inch.
Loading and unloading a single-action revolver is not the fastest thing to do. What can you tell me about it?
Placing the hammer at half-cock and using the shell ejector, each expended shell ejected nicely and cleanly. In some cases, due to the light loads used, the expended 45 Colt shell just fell out from the chambers without prompting with the ejector rod. Load 1, skip 1. Load 4, close the loading gate. Pull the hammer to its full cock position. Control the hammer drop while pulling the trigger to place the firing pin on an empty chamber, and you are ready to shoot again.
Whoa, you mentioned dropping the hammer. Would it not be simpler to pull the trigger with the hammer over an empty chamber?
While it would be, that is not a safe practice, in my humble opinion, and it does not matter if a revolver is being looked at while shopping for a single-action revolver, or even a double-action revolver for that matter. I never just pull the trigger in single-action mode and let the hammer fall freely. I have found that the pinch method, using the middle finger and thumb of the sport hand to squeeze the hammer, and placing the forefinger, the trigger finger, in front of the hammer face to be the most secure of decocking methods. The cowboy method of decocking a single-action revolver may look flashy, but it is not the safest decocking method to use. With newer single-action revolvers, like Ruger, that has a transfer bar safety, which minimizes or even mitigates the possibility of the firing pin from striking the primer of a live cartridge, I still believe in controlled decocking.
Which brings up the question of dry firing the Uberti. What are your thoughts about that?
While not specifically mentioned in any Uberti documentation for single-action revolvers, I make it a good practice to use snap caps of the appropriate caliber for dry firing any of my firearms. A snap cap provides a buffer for the firing pin to strike, instead of open air or banging against the firing pin stop. that could damage the firearm over time. To put it simply, I have an investment in all my firearms, and I want to protect that investment. Using snap caps for dry firing is just one inexpensive way I can do that. If you decide to practice or dry fire with the revolver, I highly recommend the use of snap caps, and I prefer the A-Zoom snap caps over all others. Dry firing these revolvers without snap caps is not recommended, as it could damage the hammer-mounted firing pin. Enough said about that.
Is the Uberti 1875 Remington easy to maintain?
The Uberti 1875 Remington is very easy to maintain. To disassemble, check first to make sure that the revolver is empty. Then disassemble the revolver using the following steps. Open the loading gate. Place the hammer in its half-cock notch. Press and hold the base pin catch in. This is the spring-loaded plunger that is located on the left front side of the frame. Slide the base pin all the way out. Remove the cylinder toward the loading gate. Inspect all areas of the revolver for signs of excessive wear or damage. Clean the barrel, cylinder, and cylinder chambers with a good and approved cleaning solvent. Pay a special attention to the areas around the forcing cone and above the forcing cone at the top strap. Lubricate moving parts with a good lubricant, not excessively, just enough to ensure smooth operation. Reassemble the revolver, first by opening the loading gate and moving the hammer to the half-cock position. Insert the cylinder into the frame from the right side by using a light turning motion in a counterclockwise direction to align the ratchet with the hand. Once in place, press down on the cylinder rod base pin and insert the cylinder rod into the cylinder until seated fully. This is where I insert snap caps into each of the cylinder's chambers. Close the loading gate. Cycle the revolver several times to ensure no binding. Remove the snap caps and the revolver is range ready.
Okay, So at this point, the 1875 Remington is ready for the range. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. The range session actually ended up as 2 range sessions, due to a problem that I ran into.
A problem? Really? Tell me about that?
My second trip to the range revealed a flaw with the revolver. With the light loads of the cowboy grade 250 grain loads from Pro Grade that I had used in the first range session, there seemed to be no problem that I could detect. However, I was shooting a hotter 250 grain cowboy load from Georgia Arms on the second trip. That is when the problem reared its ugly head. When attempting to unload the second round fired, the cylinder would bind to the point that it had to be removed. I looked closely at the base of the ammunition being fired and the recoil shield of the revolver. There was a step that was quite dominant in the machining of the frame. The step was dominant enough to catch my fingernail, and it seemed dominant enough to catch the rim or primer of the expended shell casing. The frame was obviously machined this way by the manufacturer. In essence, the frame's recoil shield is thicker behind the cartridge to be fired than in any other place. I really don't mind all this, as this area takes the brunt of the recoiling shell casing, and thicker is better. However, a graduated thickness is better than a step thickness. Now, I could either send the revolver back for replacement or repair, or attempt to rectify the situation myself. I decided on the latter. I needed to bevel the edge enough to allow a fired case and primer to slide over the step, rather than coming to an abrupt stop. A jeweler's flat file and a piece of extremely fine emery cloth came into play. I lightly filed the offending step at about a 45-degree angle, until the cylinder would not bind on any of the expended shells. This meant filing and fitting often. I did not want to remove too much metal, but just enough metal where I could not feel my fingernail catching on the step, and cylinder drag could not be felt when the cylinder was rotated with expended cases. Once the step felt smooth, the very fine piece of emery cloth was placed on the file and the step rubbed to remove the file marks and lightly polish the surface of the now beveled edge. I finally reached a point where no binding was detected as the cylinder was rotated with once-fired casings. At this point, it was time to stop any further filing and go for polishing only. Sometimes, you just have to go for it and hope for the best.
So, what was the result?
The result was that I now had a perfectly functioning revolver. No issues with binding with any ammunition was experienced after this. Let me show you the range session after the fix.
I would like that. I think that your viewers would like that as well.
Okay, here we go. I'll make comments as we travel on through the range session.
That was a very nice range session. What was your impression of the range session?
At the range, the Uberti 1875 Remington is a pleasure to shoot. It is surprising how accurate these reproductions actually are. Shooting one-handed is easy, if you do your part. This was not a testament to my shooting, but it is a testament to the accuracy this revolver is capable of. With the 2.5-pound trigger in this revolver, one has to be cognizant of trigger control at all times when the hammer is cocked, because surprise breaks are the norm. The front sight seemed to be well regulated for the distances at which I was shooting, probably more than I was. I am always elated when a .45 caliber bullet hits a steel target, fixed or swinging. Uberti 1875 Remington is quite capable of ringing steel.
Wow, this has been quite an interview. What are your final thoughts on the Uberti 1875 Remington reproduction?
First of all, there were many for whom the 1875 Remington was the weapon of choice. Among them was Buffalo Bill Cody, whose piece is in the Cody Museum with a handwritten note by Cody. It never failed me, and also was carried by Outlaws Frank and Jesse James. The 1875 Remington was also carried by the agents who murdered Chief Sitting Bull. However, it is claimed that the predecessor of the 1875 and 1890 New Army was used to actually dispatch Sitting Bull. The 1875 has been featured in numerous films, including being carried by Ned Pepper, played by Robert Duvall in the early version of True Grit, and carried by Bruce Dern in the western Will Penny. The Remington 1875 was Sheriff Seth Bullock's firearm throughout the series Deadwood. The 1875 Remington revolver was, in my mind, the last true Remington revolver, as the sale was non-existent with the Remington's 1888 New Army Pocket and 1890 New Model Army revolvers. I do have a reproduction of the Remington 1890 New Model Army revolver, as the original was manufactured in limited numbers and is highly desired as a collectible. I, however, will have to settle with an excellent reproduction of this revolver, and that is fine with me. I'll produce a review of the Remington 1890 in the near future. The Uberti 1875 Remington revolver is a fine example of the original, only with modern materials and manufacturing. Take a break from modern firearms, slow down, step back into history for a bit while shooting reproductions of the revolvers that helped to bring handguns into the modern age, a time when real gun control was determined by how well you handled a handgun, rifle, and shotgun. Come to think of it, that fact still remains today.
Well, this has been a fascinating journey. Thanks you for sharing your thoughts on the Uberti 1875 Remington reproduction.
No, thank you for being my alter ego and guiding me through this presentation.
Anything that you would like to say to our viewers before we close out?
I would like to thank you, the viewers, for sticking with me as I had this discussion with my other self. I hope that you enjoyed this chapter in the Range Ronin Chronicles, a journey of my journeys. I hope that you will return to the channel for my other reviews. Till we meet again, and I hope that we do, be vigilant, be armed, and be safe out there.